a leader, a true leader who has credentials behind the great work you've already been doing.
It's enhanced my understanding, it's enhanced my skill set, it's improved my mindset. It makes all the difference.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Creating and Sustaining Menopause-Friendly Workplace Digital event. My name is Mary Bolawale, and I am an event delivery coordinator at CMI. Don't forget to join the conversation by using the live chat box. Feel free to ask any questions you have for the speakers, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session. I will now hand over to Sarah Spear, the Stakeholder Engagement Lead of the CMI East Midland and Regional Board, and then Amy Kendrick, the Chair of the CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board, to begin today's event.
Fab. Thank you so much, Mary, and welcome everybody. It's great to have a good turnout for this event, and we're really excited to be discussing this really important topic and hopefully being able to give you a greater understanding and some really practical things that you can actually do in your own workplaces. So we've got two fantastic guests that are joining us for today. So we've got Professor of People and Organisation at the Open University Business School, Professor Jo Brewis. And we've also, from CEO of Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace, we've got Deborah Garlick. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have. So we've got some questions to kickstart our conversation. So the first one that I'm going to ask you both is, can you just give us a bit of an overview of what we should know about menopause and why it's a workplace issue? I'm going to start with Deborah first.
So the question, why is it a workplace issue? I think that's a really, really good question, because, of course, as long as there have been women on this earth, there's been the menopause. But the reality is we are living in a different time now. There are more women in the workplace than ever before. We're working for longer. We're living for longer and we're working for longer. And more of us have more senior positions, bigger responsibilities. And yes, so actually organisations that become menopause friendly are really perfect places for us in today's generation. So I'll let Jo talk you through the 4 reasons why, but I would start with it's absolutely essential from the perspective of we're probably the first generation, Jo, that's ever experienced what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Hi, everybody, by the way, and thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Sarah and Amy for inviting us. Just to give you a super quick overview of what menopause is, it's basically the point in, I'm going to say woman, but I want to come back to that later, a woman's life when she hasn't had a period for 12 months. So actually menopause is literally 24 hours in duration. Typically, you will get what are called perimenopause, perimenopausal symptoms. They usually start, not always, again, very variable, usually start in somebody's late 40s, but it's only when you haven't had a period for 12 months that you are menopausal for that day, and afterwards you're postmenopausal. In terms of the 4 cases that Deborah mentioned, she's already mentioned the demographic case, which is simply the fact that there are many more people who have the appropriate biological plumbing, to use a technical term, who are either staying in work or returning to work in greater numbers. And typically, as Deborah says, menopause will hit often at a time when we are either striving to or have already achieved seniority in our careers. There's also a very clear legal case. So in this country, there are the Equality Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and various ancillary legislation, which means that in lots of different ways, it's actually illegal to discriminate against people at work because they're suffering from the menopausal symptoms. And there have been some quite high profile employment tribunals cases that have succeeded either partially or wholly on the basis of menopausal symptoms. There's also the economic case, which shows that not only do gender pay gaps, which tend to widen between men and women in their 50s, contribute very significantly to the gender pension gap, which stands at something horrifying like 38%. So we think that women reducing their hours or leaving work altogether because of symptoms is having a distinct knock-on effect there, and a very problematic one. But there's also some really increasingly substantial data about lost productivity, which obviously is an enormous concern for employers. So, for example, there's been some fairly robust studies done in the States which suggest that hot flushes and night sweats alone, so that single symptom, costs the US economy something like $2.2 billion per annum, which is, really quite frightening. And then, of course, there's the social responsibility case, which is my personal favourite. And that's simply, this is the right thing to do. As a caring, compassionate employer, why wouldn't you want to support your employees in all of their glorious diversity, including menopause?
Fantastic. And I've learned something already, because I never knew about the 24-hour period. You use these terms all the time, don't you? And it's actually good to kind of clarify exactly what periods we're referring to. Okay, so my next question then. So diving into this a little bit deeper. So how can menopause actually affect people in their work? And are there different groups of people that might be affected in different ways? And I'm going to start with Jo first for this one.
Yeah, I'm actually doing a project with Deborah at the moment where I'm reviewing the more recent literature on menopause at work. So starting in 2017 up to the present day. So I do feel quite well equipped to answer this question at the moment. I think it's important to point out, first of all, that there's what we sometimes call a bidirectional relationship between symptoms and work. So in other words, symptoms can make work a more miserable place to be, but work can also make symptoms worse. So that's really important. I think it's also really important to say, and again, to revisit the point that menopause is massively variable. It's unique to everyone who goes through it. And what that means is that some people will quite literally, in the vernacular, sail through. They'll barely notice anything, and then one day their periods will stop. Then we go all the way to the other end to, and we, again, estimates vary, but we think that it's probably something between 10 and 25% of people who are quite seriously debilitated by their menopausal symptoms, and then a whole set of folk in between. But just to give you some examples, some of the most common symptoms reported are things like hot flushes and night sweats, which can obviously make work really difficult to cope with in terms of temperatures being too high. There's mood swings, there's focus and concentration, which really affect detailed work or work where you have to make quick decisions. For example, imagine a surgeon suddenly losing concentration when she's got a scalpel in her hand. There's things like noise sensitivity. You can even get more sensitive to smell, which obviously in noisy and smelly workplaces isn't going to be great. There's joint pain and muscle pain, which again can seriously affect particularly people who do a lot of manual work, heavy lifting and that kind of thing. Erratic periods, particularly menstrual flooding, can be an absolute nightmare to manage at work, especially if you're in an environment where you can't just nip off to the loo every 5 minutes to make sure that you haven't bled through your knickers and your outfit. And I could go on and on and on and on and on. Anxiety and depression, itchy skin, all sorts of different things. I mean, we sometimes hear the point that there are 34 symptoms of menopause. Actually, that's a myth. There's no definitive list, but we know that there are tens and tens and tens of menopausal symptoms, and that's important. And just to address the second part of your question, Sarah, it is also really important to recognise that everybody is unique. And although we don't have a lot of evidence or much evidence at all about how different groups of people experience menopause in the workplace, we do know, for example, that people who are neurodiverse are much more likely to perhaps struggle more with menopausal symptoms and can actually exacerbate some of the issues that they have with their neurodiversity. We know that there are ethnic and racial differences, or at least reported differences in how symptoms occur. So hot flushes are more prevalent in some populations than others. We know that women who go through early menopause often have a more difficult time coping with their symptoms. And there's all sorts of other things to bring in there as well. I mean, one particular thing I want to say before I shut up, which harks back to something I opened with, is that there's one group of people that we don't know anything about in the workplace, and that's transgender and gender non-conforming people, because the basic fact of the matter is, if you have ovaries, no matter how you identify gender-wise, you will go through menopause. And I think it's particularly important to realise that that group of people, again, are likely to find menopause very triggering, because it's a reminder of a gender that they don't recognise themselves as inhabiting. I will shut up.
And if I can add to that, when we started this journey, coming up for a decade ago, Jo, everybody recognises hot flushes. So as you say, there's the research in the US around hot flushes. But research after research, and I'm thinking back here, Jo, to the research we did with the TUC, which was a little bit of a surprise for us. Because the question that was asked of women, nearly 4,000, all but 2 people, what symptoms affect you most at work? And hot flushes didn't come top. And that was a point where we said, actually, we need to understand this better. And the symptoms women talked about was the anxiety and worry, was the brain fog and difficulty in concentrating, difficulty sleeping. Hot flushes was in there. But it wasn't top. In fact, people in the verbatims were saying, I know what to do when I get a hot flush. I dress accordingly. I might take my cardi off. I sit somewhere where it might be a little bit cooler. But certainly, one of the things that is changing, and particularly in those organisations that are focusing on this, is the awareness and understanding of the range of symptoms. Because what we see, or what we've seen throughout this journey, is when people understand the range of symptoms, the physical, the psychological, even the long-term symptoms, they may well, and we see this for women that come to colleague sessions, and they might think menopause is on the radar, so I should really go to this. But then when they see the symptoms slides going up, that's when you see a light bulb moment, and you see people saying, well, I've already got that, and I've got that, and I'm not getting treatment for that. I had no idea that could be the menopause. And the light bulb moment is, as you say, Jo, is one day in time, but that transition when hormones start to happen, and the perimenopause phase is the most mysterious of them all. You might not have any other symptoms or ability to recognize that you've entered that phase, but symptoms have started. I've never had a hot flush. So when mine started, I had no idea that what I was experiencing was the menopause. And this is where education is absolutely key, because if you know what to look for and you know what to do about it, then whether this is workplace or at home, then you are empowered to do something about it. So I would say that is something that is absolutely key to understand in terms of symptoms and work. And you've mentioned, Jo, the ethnicity, neurodiversity. In the last decade, if we cast our mind back, the first slides that we stood in front of, they were kind of basic, had the fundamentals, ages, stages, symptoms, solutions. But the more and more we're getting into this conversation, the more we're getting the opportunity to explore that uniqueness. And that's where the neurodiversities come into it. But I would also say another consideration at work is when you're looking at barriers, it might be a cultural barrier. But you've also got people who consider menopause to be a very personal matter. And why would I talk about it at work? And this is where the importance comes in. And I know I was at the Nottingham University Hospitals this morning, and they've done remarkable things, but their drumbeat is going all the time because they recognise new people are coming to menopause. They have a churn of staff, and they want to make sure everybody understands menopause. So it's still taboo. It shouldn't be. Nirvana, Jo, is when we say, get to the point where people go, of course, I know all about menopause, symptoms, not really. And it's just a normal conversation. But understanding symptoms, I think, is absolutely key.
Fab. And I think a lot of people listening will be sort of thinking, what can I do in my workplace? How do I support people going through menopause? So can you give some advice for organisations and managers in supporting people who are going through menopause, and maybe share some best practice that you've got from many of the organisations you've worked with, maybe. If I go to Deborah first again for this one.
Thank you. And yes, we've already said that every individual is unique in this experience, but also so are organisations. We've supported thousands over the last decade and seen what they've done and understood what works and maybe what doesn't work. And one of the things I would say does not work is a tick box or sheep dip exercise. Download a template and just put it in, where you usually put your policies. Appreciating the uniqueness of your organization is absolutely key. All organizations have a different culture, a different leadership style, different geographies, workplaces. Manufacturing versus retail versus offices will be very different. And many have existing things already in place. You might have an EAP provider. So starting with that perspective, I would say the good news is, while all organizations are unique, there are some key areas of focus that can make a huge difference. So thinking about policies and guidance documents, doing something that's appropriate for your organisation. And Nottingham University Hospitals brought together their unions, people in the organisation, some of their line managers, the wellbeing team, and it was co-created with listening to people. And they were asking the fundamental questions of what's getting in the way of you being at your best at work and what can we do to help? And their policy is rather large, but at the same time, it's very, very thorough. So policies or guidance documents, thinking of the individual that's struggling, that can go and find it and know that the organisation considers it important and this is what they're going to do to help. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's a policy or guidance document. That can be a personal choice for various reasons. But that document on its own will not help that much if there is still this reticence to step forward and talk about it. And we often hear from people that think, they might be on the verge of leaving, they might be struggling with the menopause symptoms, and they might not want to talk to anybody. We know a lot about silent leavers. So getting the conversation going is absolutely key. And I think some key things there, the things that work every time, is when you've got senior leadership involved in this. It's remarkable when the boss says it's important to us when we talk about menopause. I'm thinking here of Chris Pitt, the CEO of First Direct, who came to a menopause session and he said, "I've just realised I'm not the husband I thought I was." And we all loved him for it. But his commitment was, nobody in my workplace will struggle like that. So getting senior leaders to talk about it enables everyone to talk about menopause. But back to the drumbeat, raising awareness, having conversations, whether it's in support groups, menopause cafes, shared stories are really important for getting that conversation going. And there's 3 times a year: International Women's Day, Menopause Awareness Month, and probably actually there'll be a lot of activity in May during Mental Health Week. But whatever you do, giving people the opportunity to speak up and normalising the conversation. I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about that too, Jo. But also training. Training is different to raising awareness, because your question, Sarah, was about managers. And actually, I feel for managers on this because we see them every day. And they come to menopause sessions looking sometimes a little bit terrified. And we always do a little poll at the beginning that says, tell us what your level of knowledge is about menopause and are you confident to talk about it? And the answer is usually, I don't know what I don't know. And no, so therefore I'm not confident to talk about it. And a lot of people saying, what if I get it wrong? What if I offend somebody? I just don't have the language to talk about this. Or even one I heard again the other day, I don't know about HRT, so how can I talk about menopause? But when you explain the facts, ages, stages, symptoms, solutions, how they can talk about menopause, then it takes a lot of that away. And when you say, as we did respond to that manager, you might not know a lot about an epidural, but you can have a maternity meeting. Suddenly he understood his role It's not about prescribing. That's certainly not something we'd expect to do. And I think the final point in terms of those key areas of focus would be looking at the workplace. Joe mentioned some workplaces can make symptoms worse. And we're seeing a lot of organisations doing audits. And I think my only observation of that, when organisations have talked to us about it, asking those questions, what's getting in the way of you being at your best and what can we do to help? Big listening. It's very rarely could you build an office block, a block of shower cubicles. It's usually small things that make a big difference. And they're usually very, very low cost. But I would start with asking what's getting in the way rather than making assumptions.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Deborah said. I think the really important thing here is that you can have the most brilliant policy in the world. You can have the most fabulous approach to reasonable adjustments to accommodate people's menopausal symptoms. You can have a fabulous absence policy, which not only doesn't penalise people for taking days off due to symptoms, but also allows them to tick menopause as a reason for absence if they want to. You can have, again, really, really compassionate and constructive flexible working arrangements, which we would also advocate if that's something that would help the people who are affected. You can give people noise cancelling headphones. You can give them desk fans. You can do a thermal audit, which, checks out which parts of the office or building are warmer or colder than others. You can do 1,000,001 different things. But if the culture hasn't changed, or as Deborah would put it, the hearts and minds haven't changed, then none of that stuff will stick. So just to give you an example, and I won't name names here, but there was an organisation that Deborah and I worked with really early on, and it was very much a leader in its field at the time, and it produced what we thought was an excellent menopause policy. And on the back of that, set up menopause cafes. There were even roadshows to ensure that staff who were working in other parts of the organisation, not in the main HQ, if you like, were able to listen to and take this stuff on board. But what we then discovered was that we'd done all what we thought this fabulous comms work, really trying to get it out there, really trying to raise awareness. And yet there were still people who either didn't know the policy existed, it was quite a large organisation, but had no idea about the policy, or managers who hadn't really got the memo. So we're saying things like, yes, you can go to the menopause cafe today, but you have to do it during your lunch break, rather than giving them protected time, which is what we would prefer, to go and have this informal conversation with others who are interested in the subject. So I suppose it's what you might call the trickle-down effect. All of these things can exist, but if people, A, don't know about them, and B, don't understand why they're important, then they're not going to stick. So I think that's the one thing that I would like to get across. We can do fabulous, fabulous things at work to support folk who are struggling with their symptoms. Some of them cheap, some of them more expensive, some of them basically taking account, as Deborah said, of stuff that's already in place, like an employee assistance program, as long as they know what they're doing around menopause. But it's the culture that's the kind of binding glue, if you like. And what we see in our really, really strong menopause-friendly organisations is that they have worked so hard to normalise menopause in their workplace that the culture has changed.
No, and you mentioned sort of the Nottingham University Hospitals. Is there any other organisations that you can sort of give as good examples that you've worked with before, either of you, and things that they might have implemented perhaps that worked?
I'd probably start with E.ON. I'm looking central, sort of in the Midlands area. There's lots, Sarah. There are some remarkable examples, both public sector and private sector. And if I think of E.ON, they were one of the first in the UK, and therefore probably the world, to launch their menopause policy. That went live in October 2017. But what they did, when I mentioned those areas of focus, they looked at each of those areas of focus and focused on them, rather than just assuming a piece of paper or an electronic document was just going to do it. And they're still working today. They've achieved the menopause-friendly accreditation. And what's very obvious is that it's simply the way they do things around there now. I popped in just before Christmas to meet some of their leads and hear about what it was that they were doing. And I was met with one of their very senior leaders, a male, and he's a menopause champion. And he talks about menopause all the time. So not only have they broken down the barriers of feeling comfortable talking about menopause, they did structured training. Their occupational health lead at the time, back in 2017, if I remember rightly, was the one that was leading it, but she was so passionate about it that she was almost infectious. And you know, they listen a lot to their people and ask those questions. What can we do to help? And do it. So, you know, the fact that you've got such a senior male that will pop into a line manager group and talk about menopause, for me, says it all. They're remarkable. The same I'd say with Boots. And one of the things that was really interesting, I think, with Boots, because of course they did all of the key areas of focus. But one of the things that they were passionate about was we want to do this for our people, but also bearing in mind when we educate our people, take, for example, the wonderful number 7 team that might be, you know, giving me advice on my foundation or whatever. And they trained them up as well, because they said, actually, this is an internal, external thing. And if we're training up our teams, then we want them to be able to talk to our customers and be empathetic towards our customers. So they're a couple of just the standout ones. Joe, any other, well, I'll let you, any others that you'd name check?
Sorry, I'm just looking for the mute button. There is one that really struck me. And again, this was one that went through menopause-friendly accreditation. One of the first ones through, actually, and it was ATOS, who effectively are in my backyard. I'm pointing at them now. Obviously, a very big organisation with very significant responsibilities. And one of the things that they did, which really struck me, was when they went through, we were kind of, I guess I would say we were over the worst hump of COVID, but we didn't know there was still quite a lot of bad stuff to come. So like many other organisations in the country, they had transitioned to a lot of their staff working at home. And I assume that persists to this day, as it does for many other employers. But one of the things that they did, and I really thought this was going above and beyond, was not only, so staff that were still office-based, they could have DSE inspections or reviews to make sure, for example, especially if you're menopausal, that your chair is appropriate for you, that your computer's at the right height, your desk's at the right height. And all of that is not only a legal obligation, but it can also protect against things like menopausal joint and muscle pain. And also, if you are working at a computer where the light is flickering or the light is glaring, that can really exacerbate things like menopausal migraines. So all of that is very important for menopausal staff and obviously lots of other folk too. But what they did was they rolled those DSE inspections out and sent their home workers packs that they could go through to review their own settings. And they made appropriate furniture and so on available for their home-based staff. Now, that is above and beyond, right? But my organisation does it. If you raise it, it's something that the OU will provide. But I suppose that's real, what I would call best-in-class stuff. It's not just looking at the people that you can see in front of you. It's making sure that all of the staff everywhere are really incorporated. And we might think also about, I think it was Bradford Uni, Deborah,
Yes.
who not only made sure, again, that they had roadshows to capture people like estate and cleaning staff who don't work standard hours a lot of the time, but also translated a lot of the information into languages which are very prevalent in Bradford, like Urdu and Hindi and Arabic, so that everybody could read this stuff and understand it, even if they weren't necessarily very, very proficient in reading English. So again, it's just about thinking, where are my staff? Who are my staff? And the differences between the staff groups, and making sure you're catering for all of them.
I'd probably also add to that, Joe, because you're right, it was the University of Bradford, and that was because the team were great. And when we did training there, it was very obvious that if you like, the room that was full of people for training looked very different than the walk down the driveway. And when we asked the question of why is that, it was actually a cultural barrier where women, Asian women, were saying, we can't talk about this because there's men in the room. We wanted to make it an inclusive conversation. So there were male, female. And what we did is set up a session for 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time there was a preference. And it made it women's only, because that was the only way to make that environment comfortable. But I think, in considering all of these different areas of focus, you might have some people that are thinking, crikey, how on earth do you get going with that? And I think that's one for us to make sure we cover off. But I would say another example of exemplary is Leicestershire County Council. And the reason I would say it's exemplary, because they, again, published their policy. Well, they started working on their policy in 2017, and it's been reviewed. And they've got people that work in grounds. They've got people that work on the road. They've got people that work in the office. And, they've constantly chipped away and listened and then followed the next step. But the other thing that is obvious in that organisation is how passionate the people are that are doing this. Because people often say, well, is this ED&I then? Well, no, it's actually good for people, good for business, and good for the organisation and good for the society. But we do see some ED&I people that take the lead. Some organisations, it's the wellbeing lead. In some organisations, it might be HR. And what we feel, what we see in making this sustainable is it's not one person's job. We see one of the things we're seeing trending is menopause champions in organisations. And, I've had organisations, I've already mentioned a male champion, and male and female genders, and they take the responsibility of making sure that things are rolled out in their area, but also being stopped in the corridor and having a listening ear for somebody. So, having passionate people, we would call that bottom up, Joe, probably. But you've also got to have senior leadership involved in this, and maybe facilities. But I would say what we've seen time and time again is when project teams come together that have got representation, and they start to look at those key areas of focus and say, what can we do? How can we tap into these people? And most start with an awareness session, which is just opening up the conversation. But that's often where those champions come from. That's when you might recognise somebody that says, I'll be happy to share my story, and I'd be happy to take the responsibility in my area, or just run the menopause cafes, whatever it might be. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That gives us a really good way of seeing how some of this has actually worked in practice. So I want to give a chance for some of the questions that have been submitted prior to the event, and also anyone wants to submit a question in the chat. I think we've had a couple through already. Please do so. So I'll bring Amy back, and she's going to lead on asking some of these questions to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Joe and Deborah. That was absolutely fascinating, and I've learned something, lots of things too, that I didn't know before. So thanks ever so much for your time. We've had some pre-submitted questions, so I'll start with those if that's okay. We have touched on this, but you said, Deborah, that your nirvana would be when it wasn't taboo anymore, and that people just talked about it as a normal conversation. Can you pinpoint anything else? And by the way, this is a question from Pamela. Anything else that we can do to educate managers when the subject can still be so taboo in lots of organisations?
Yeah, I can. And I all of those things I said earlier about line managers is our experience. In society's starting to change now. You see celebrities talking about menopause, you see it in the papers. But the reality is line managers have not had, from a society perspective, greater understanding of menopause than anybody else. You might have them wondering, well, why is this my job? This is something that is to do with women's stuff. But often what we find works best with managers, and I mentioned earlier, even with colleague sessions, making sure it's an inclusive conversation, making sure you're inviting everybody to this so it's not a women's only issue, and explaining to managers why it's important. I mentioned earlier about this being in a different time, but when, for example, a senior leader talks about this, or you're implementing a policy, explaining to managers those 4 key reasons. The one that really cuts through and that many managers recognise is, for example, the business case around this, appreciating we're in a tight labour market. They might have already seen people leaving their teams. You've got to consider the retention of staff, and we know significant number, Joe, and I'll let you share how many actually leave the workplace during their menopause transition, and it's very, very costly. And also from an employment brand perspective, we're seeing more organisations put the menopause-friendly badge in and getting the talent going to them, which many of those managers, so they will talk to them in their own language, the things that they will recognise, that this is an important priority in the workplace, that this is about helping your team members thrive at an important stage. And very often I see people saying things, or that appreciation that we experience menopause in midlife, not towards the end of our lives. And actually, many of us will work through to our 70s. So support somebody going through the menopause. If they hit a bump in the road, they could be with you for another 20 years. So there's lots of real benefits, and line managers need to understand that. I would also say a little tip. One of the things that we were working for an organisation who decided to make it mandatory or recommended training. And there was an individual who seemed to be quite influential in the line manager group in his organisation. He was on the first session and we had a really good chat. And he went back to his desk and, using the email distribution list, said, "That was the best training I have ever had. I wish I'd have known about this." Every session was absolutely packed. So can you involve some of your line managers in shaping the system, maybe even opening up them? And I would also say managers need to know the why, the fact about menopause, not into huge detail, but ages, stages, symptoms, and how to help somebody during their menopause, and how to have a good conversation and signposting to where help and support is available. So you can do that in an hour easily. And but I would say probably for me, the tip is involving managers in that. We also see managers being, it was actually HSBC UK that I saw this for the first time. Anybody that's new to line management, appreciating that many are promoted due to their technical skills, have to go to a course. They call it their university. And it's a mandatory subject in that. So new line managers, newly promoted line managers, all included in menopause. So it doesn't just have to be the one-off event. Include it in the structure, the induction, the new line managers, and make sure it's very, very relevant.
Thanks, Deborah. Jo, anything you wanted to add on that one?
Yeah, again, thanks, Amy. I completely endorse everything that Deborah said. Just to, I think, really drive the point home, Deborah alluded to a really important study that was published in 2021, and it was really game-changing for us because it was peer-reviewed. It was based on an enormous sample of people who'd been surveyed throughout their lives as part of what's called the National Childhood Development Study. But this particular analysis of some of the data from that study captured the women in the sample from at the age of 50 and at the age of 55. And when Evan Drew et al., that was the authors, crunched all the numbers, they realised that, first of all, in this sample, 53.5% of women reported that they had at least one troublesome symptom, one symptom that was getting in the way of their everyday lives. So that was the majority of the sample. Secondly, when they tracked their employment from 50 to 55, what they found was that the women who'd reported having at least one serious symptom were 23% more likely to have reduced their working hours by the time they hit 55, and 43% more likely to have left work altogether. Now, I'm giving you those stats because, I'm an academic. I believe in peer review. I believe in things that have been looked at by other people to make them valid and robust. There's a lot of claims flying around in the wider media about the numbers of women who leave work every year because of menopause. And Deborah and I often joke about this and say, how are there even any menopausal women in the workforce if these numbers are leaving year upon year upon year? So I give you those data because they've been academically validated. But just to go back to this really nice question from Pamela, I think what managers need to know as well is that for most people, menopause is a normal part of life. It doesn't come early or even prematurely, although that does happen for 1 in 100 women before the age of 40, and it can happen because of surgery to remove your ovaries or breast cancer drugs like tamoxifen. But for the vast majority of us, it is normal and natural, and it will usually the symptoms will start in your late 40s, but may persist into postmenopause as well. And that's certainly been my personal experience. So for most people, it is normal and natural, but underline, it's a phase. It's a period in our lives. It won't go on forever. And for a lot of us, we either don't necessarily need any accommodations at work, apart from, people being aware that we might struggle at times. And even if we do need accommodations, a lot of them will be cheap and a lot of those will be short term. I think it's also really important when you're training managers to, as Deborah says, train them in having what can be very sensitive conversations. So there are issues there about what kind of questions to ask, the real vitality, the real importance of confidentiality, and the importance of acting afterwards. So not just sitting and providing a listening ear, but if someone's suggested to their manager what might help them, then managers need to be trained to put that into place or to go to someone who can put that into place. And I think the other thing is, and this goes for all sorts of training and awareness raising at work, it's really important, and I think I certainly fall into this trap sometimes, of not presenting this phase of our lives as, oh God, it's going to be absolutely awful. My capacity at work is going to go through the floor. I'm going to be a hormonal, raging, bleeding, sweating beast who, can't do her work properly and really should just be at home. That is a stereotype which we really need to avoid. We need to avoid reducing women and anyone else who has ovaries to those ovaries as if we're all completely at the mercy of our hormones. So stressing how normal and natural it is for the vast majority of us. Yes, a lot of us have troublesome symptoms. I certainly do. But these can be managed not only by ourselves in terms of good lifestyle and all of that kind of thing, but small tweaks at work will often make the difference. So that's just what I would add. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Deborah, do you want to come in?
I do. Yes, because you mentioned a couple of things that I would say from a line manager perspective are very helpful triggers. So, as you say, Jo, for the majority of us, we'll get through this. It'll be absolutely fine. No need for menopause anxiety, anticipation anxiety, if we all understand the facts. But from a line manager's role and responsibility, we often hear about surgical menopause, and hysterectomy, oophorectomy can be at any age. And if you're working, you'll probably be having a conversation with your line manager about what's involved. And that's a really good time for a line manager to have a conversation with that individual when they're returning to work about, are you talking to your doctor about menopause? Because many people experience more troublesome menopauses when they've gone through surgical or induced menopause, whether that's breast cancer. And so it's important to understand or upskill them so that they can look out for and maybe even get ahead of those conversations. Many women don't realise menopause is around the corner when they've had a hysterectomy or they're going to be plunged into menopause, because that's not where the NHS don't all routinely say, by the way, when I said you won't have periods anymore, that means that your hormones are going to dramatically change and you are post-menopause. So I think that's important to understand. And one thing that you mentioned there, Jo, about roles and responsibilities, you mentioned about us being balanced about this. So we're not talking about it to the point of managers are going to think, actually, why are we employing so many menopausal women? It sounds like it's hard work to manage them. It's not. The majority of us won't experience really debilitating symptoms. But in that, I also want us to consider the different roles and responsibilities in this, because I mentioned that my line managers aren't prescribing. They don't need to know about HRT. They need to know what in the workplace will help. But also as an individual, we have responsibilities. So when you're looking at training up people in your organisation, thinking about the colleagues, enabling them to understand what's going on for them, but also enabling them to have good conversations with their healthcare practitioner. Because we know that's the number one thing that we hear from women. How do I get, I went to see my doctor, I didn't necessarily get what I expected. What can they do to have a really good conversation and get the outcome that they're looking for, as well as having a conversation with their people? So so line managers have got a big job, but actually our experience is they don't need to be, it's not massive. An hour will probably do it, and that will enable them to do it. One thing I think we do need to consider is men in this, because often people think it's male managers. I think all managers need to be trained on this.
Yeah, and I was fascinated, Deborah, to hear that of the organisation who've made it mandatory training. That's fabulous. So making it as critical as health and safety training or cybersecurity training, GDPR. That's fabulous, isn't it? That's a real commitment by that organisation.
It is.
That's great.
Just on that one, where you can't make it mandatory, because many organisations will say we only do mandatory training for regulatory reasons.
Yeah.
We found so many organisations got around that by calling it recommended training. It just took it out of the whole bunch of training that was available and put it to the top.
That's great. Thank you. I've got a question here from Debbie, which is quite a practical question, if that's okay, which is, how do we minimise the impact of reasonable adjustments, which, as you've outlined, could be varied? How do we minimise the impact of those reasonable adjustments on other members of the team who might not be impacted by menopause or symptoms? And obviously referencing confidentiality there as well. There are some people who aren't comfortable to talk about it, wouldn't want that shared. So how would you recommend dealing with that in the workplace? Jo, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think that's another really excellent question. In fact, I published something relatively recently about what you might call the hot flush wars in organisations. So, somebody's pushing the window up, someone comes right up behind them and pushes the window down, or someone turns the thermostat down and someone else charges up and turns it back up again. And we know that sort of problem is quite common in organisations where there are shared workspaces. And let's face it, a lot of us work in open plan offices these days, especially post-COVID, and especially when we're hot desking. I hot desk at work. I don't have an office anymore. So I have to book a desk or a small pod when I go down to Milton Keynes. So that really is an excellent question. I think I'm going to give a two-part answer if that's okay. So I think the first part of the answer to this is what we went back to, what we were talking about earlier around hearts and minds, and just making people aware. And this isn't about pointing to individuals and saying that person's menopausal and they need our help. This is just about raising awareness about the differential effects that menopause can have at work and why it's important to make certain kinds of adjustments, whatever they may be, to suit individual staff symptoms. I think the kind of aligned part of that, though, is that a lot of the adjustments that we recommend, a lot of the changes in behaviour, but also in workplace environment, will benefit a lot of other staff, not just menopausal women. So I think that's important to remember as well. And I always remember here, Greater Manchester Police, when they first introduced breathable uniforms, they did it as part of their menopause intervention agenda, but they didn't badge these uniforms as for hot, sweaty midlife women. They badged them as, these are useful if you find yourself getting hot during your working day. For example, if you're someone who cycles to work, these will be really useful. So I think there are some things that should and can be made available to any member of staff, and you can request them without having to go, hi, I'm menopausal. Okay. So I think that's one thing. I think where things become very tricky are around temperature regulation. I think that's probably the biggest territory where there can be sort of problematic interactions between colleagues for a whole host of different reasons, including somebody not wanting to say, I get really bad hot flushes. I can't sit in this room with the awful UV lights and the computer screens and the radiator that's always turned up to 5. But again, there are individual things that you can do there to support that employee, which aren't about affecting other employees. So, for example, you could give them a seat cooler, or you could give them packs for their wrists, or you could give them a desk fan. Okay, a desk fan is going to draw a little bit of attention to you, but there are more subtle ways of supporting somebody without expecting the whole of a 40 or 50 person strong open plan office to have the temperature down at 0, because that's what suits the 4 or 5 menopausal folk in that office. So yes, I think it's definitely about respecting confidentiality. Not everyone's particularly bothered about confidentiality. I blab on about my menopause continually at work until people are totally sick of hearing about it. But for a lot of people, it is important that confidentiality is respected. So then it's about getting creative, how to support them without revealing their menopausal status and not negatively affecting other people around them.
And I would probably add to that, Jo, because when you're changing hearts and minds and you are raising awareness, understanding and support, somebody is much more likely to say, I don't mind this being known, that I'm experiencing the menopause. It's only, it might be fewer people that are happy or that want it to be kept confidential, and others might declare it. When you've got that culture where this is a normal conversation, it would be really nice actually if colleagues said, is there anything I can do for you? Or maybe even supporting themselves. Do you want me to do that pattern, that shift pattern? Do you want me to do this? Do you want to swap this? Whatever that might be. And for me, that comes down to the conversations about roles and responsibilities. When a manager is having a conversation with an individual, and that individual comes in, because we'd encourage them to do the prep beforehand, to say, I'm experiencing the menopause. These are my symptoms. This is how they're affecting me at work. This is what would be really useful while I learn to get my symptoms under control, or while I'm talking to my healthcare practitioner about getting my symptoms under control. Not only are we all unique, but our symptoms will change over time. So those reasonable adjustments might not take long, or might not need to be in place for very long, or they might change. And the word reasonable adjustments means you work it out how you're going to make that work. And one of the individuals that was very, very close to a tribunal, this was years ago, and actually their union rang. I had a very late night conversation with the union rep, and this individual was working, and it was in a very large retailer, and they'd introduced a cap, which was in nylon. She said when she had a hot flush, she'd physically perspire, and she was front facing. She found it very embarrassing. And the line manager and the HR person had got a little bit entrenched on this. No, you have to wear that. That's the corporate brand. But when we really got to the nub of it, this was somebody that has always had good performance reviews. And we actually identified it's only the hat that's a problem. Can she work in that department instead, where she came from, before you moved her into this one with the sweaty hat? And that was no problem at all. Or some might think about, well, actually, if you're a shift worker, which patterns work best for you if you're really struggling to sleep right now. So, they don't have to be onerous. I think it is that getting creative and having really good conversations with an individual and a line manager where you're of the mindset of, how do we make this work then?
That's great, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I think we could go on forever because this is fascinating, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll hand back to Sarah to start wrapping things up.
Yes, fab. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has submitted some questions as well. We always like to end, if we can, by asking our guests for your 3 key takeaways, things that our viewers can maybe implement in their own workplaces, things they could share with their colleagues. So I'll come to Deborah first for your top 3 things.
Well, the one thing I would mention is, for those that don't know, the Employment Rights Bill is thundering through Parliament, and we expect it to be passed before the summer reset. That will mean that all employers over 250 people have to have an equality action plan in place, and that includes a menopause action plan. So don't wait for that. Start the conversation, maybe forgive yourself a little bit, because nobody's an expert in menopause when they first start this journey. Listen to your people, start the conversation, and go from there, would be my key one. And also bearing in mind, this is the financial strategist coming out in me, this will save you money. We're in a cost-cutting environment at the moment, and if you want to influence your organization's financial bottom line, then being menopause friendly can save your organization money. So lots of wonderful things about your employment brand, being an employer of choice, lots of happy people. They're the benefits. You're likely to get hit by tribunals or the Employment Rights Bill if you don't take action. So let's do it. Let's all get on with this.
Fab. Thank you, Deborah. And Jo, over to you.
Sorry, I was struggling with the mute button there. So 3 things. The first thing to remember is that menopause is literally unique to everybody who goes through it. So, I could tell you about my symptoms, but they're going to be very different from somebody else's symptoms. And that's really important to remember. And as we've said, it varies across different groups as well, although we don't understand a lot about that in the workplace. That's research that still needs to be done. I think it's also super important to remember, and we were kind of getting to this in some of the discussion around the last question, was that a lot of what we advocate for menopausal staff is really, really beneficial for other employees. I mean, we know now, for example, that flexible work is a day one right to request these days. That doesn't mean employers have to give it to you, but it does mean that they better have a really good reason not to. So, we don't need to create flexible working just for menopausal employees. That's something that employers have to have a consideration of anyway. So think about all of the different things you already do that can benefit menopausal women, but you don't necessarily have to badge them in that way. Remember Manchester Police, for example. We also know that there are lots of, and menopause is not a disease, very important to say, but there are a lot of diseases that do make you very sensitive to heat. So multiple sclerosis and different forms of arthritis, for example. So again, breathable uniforms, fans, being able to open a window can be very beneficial for those staff as well. And just finally, because you're probably thinking, oh my God, how do we start this conversation? It is so important to start it. But there are 2 places that I would direct people to, apart from Handpicked in the Workplace and menopause-friendly accreditation, because some brilliant resources there. But 2 other resources, which again are completely free to access. One of them is MIPO, MIPO, and that stands for Menopause Information Pack for Organisations. So if you just Google that, that's been produced by 2 very good friends of mine who are also academic researchers and have been working in this field for even longer than I have. And there's a bunch of free resources there that you can download. The other one, which is state of the art, and I'm not just saying that because Deborah was involved in putting it together, British Standards Institute, I think it was last year, published a standard about menopause and menstruation support at work, and it is excellent. So if you just Google BSI menopause, that will come straight up. And either of those resources, as well as all the amazing stuff that Deborah and her team have produced, will give you, I think, more than enough to be going on with, at least to open up the conversation.
That's super. Thank you so much. Deborah, I think it was a final thought you had.
No, it was just to say thank you very much for everybody joining today, and to the wonderful team at CMI. The more of us that talk about menopause, the closer we get to nirvana. Around about 50% of organisations are doing this. We want to get to the 100% mark. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, and a great note to end on. I'm sure we can share some of those resources and links that you've mentioned when we send out a follow-up email to everyone who signed up today as well. So thank you so much, Deborah and Joe and Amy, for supporting with the questions. It's been a great session. I'm just going to hand back to Mary to close for us.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So that's it for today's session. Thank you to our hosts, Sarah and Amy, and to our speakers, Joe and Deborah, for your insight and expertise. Please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership, and thank you for joining us.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.